Welcome back to Toasty Gaming. Today we're taking a look at the upcoming Fable. Or maybe not so upcoming, since it's been confirmed on the official Xbox Games podcast that the release is getting pushed back to 2026. Apparently Xbox might be terrified of having a strong independent woman heading one of their last major RPG franchises. Or maybe they're just traumatized because the last 3 RPGs they published, Fallout 76, Starfield and Avowed, were embarrassing flops each in their own right, and they probably don't want to bury Fable alongside them. Either way, 2026 it is. We did get at least a 50-second pre-alpha gameplay snippet to cope with this wait, but somehow it racked up as many dislikes as likes, which is quite the accomplishment, especially when you consider that most of the culture warriors who originally raged about the ugly girl protagonist have probably already forgotten Fable even exists. If that doesn't say something about the underlying issues, then I don't know what does. Now, I'll admit I am rather cynical about upcoming games. If you want to keep your rose-tinted glasses firmly on, I won't stop you, but let's dissect the trailer, the art direction, and the suspicious pre-alpha label. After all, we can't ignore how Fable used to be defined by whimsical comedic British flair, and how that stacks up against the new photoreal vision. Right off the bat, the trailer is 50 seconds, and there's barely anything of substance in it. Sorry, but I'm not going to fawn over a choppy vertical slice labeled pre-alpha, so defenders can say it's still unfinished. My channel's far too small to be bribed by Microsoft, so I'll call it as I see it. The big lie here is that the footage looks extremely polished, definitely not like the typical pre-alpha. Usually pre-alpha means minimal polish, zero thorough testing, and plenty of placeholder assets, but in this snippet we see crisp environments, smooth camera angles, and cinematic cuts that obviously took time and resources to choreograph. It reminds me of when Ubisoft had to apologize for Watch Dogs looking way better in trailers than it did in the actual games. Now it seems devs barely even bother with apologies. They'll just say it's pre-alpha, don't judge us, while showing off some carefully curated final-like visuals. If the game is still truly in pre-alpha and is planned to release in 2026, then the final build is guaranteed to be a massive trash heap when it releases, because they're still so early in development that there's absolutely no way to finish the game in time. Otherwise, they're just lying to our faces. Honestly, neither scenario is overly appealing if you ask me. So, the official release date has been moved back to 2026. Is that because Xbox is rethinking the Protagonist after deciding that the forced strong woman lead might not be the marketing win they hoped for? Or is it pure panic since Fallout 76, Starfield, and now very recently Avowed bombed, and they just don't want to ruin Fable 2? Yes, cynicism intensifies, but let's face it, when a company delays a game by a full year or more, it's rarely just about polish alone. Usually they see trouble brewing behind the scenes, and if your brand is already scarred by flops, better to push that release date than risk launching a half-baked fiasco. My main concern here is that the Forza studio is making this one, and from what we've seen, they have about as much to do with British myths, tales, folklore and culture as I do with advanced particle physics. The trailer feels soulless, like a generic AAA fantasy environment that's super realistic but not remotely whimsical. The original Fable had a truly unique vibe. You're basically in a British fairy tale with random passerbys calling you chicken chaser and you responding by farting in their faces. That comedic, irreverent soul was half the fun. We can't gauge if any of that remains because we only have a handful of footage clips, maybe 5 minutes total and 20 minutes of developer talk that's relevant at best, but from the polished glimpses we do have, there's no whimsical storybook style. Instead, everything is photoreal and safe. Look at Fable 1 in the background and compare how it looked deliberately drawn or stylized. In this new version, the design is so standard it might as well just be an AI prompt for generic high fantasy setting. That quick trailer shot of a city could be anywhere. It could be Hogwarts Legacy, it could be Spellforce, who knows. It's missing that distinctive British, almost rural aesthetic that made Bowerstone in the original feel immediately recognizable. Bowerstone may have had low-res textures by modern standards, but at least you knew it was Fable. With this new version, if you slapped on a different title, I wouldn't even question it. The nature also looks gorgeous in the trailer. The grass, the fields, the trees, all of them almost look real, but it's basically just the standard photoreal approach that we see in every big-budget open world. And that's what really kills me, because Fable should stand out from the pack, not blend into a marketing reel for next-gen fantasy environments you'd see published by Nvidia. It's almost funny that Xbox just can't figure out the color palettes for their games. Fable apparently isn't bright and colorful enough, and when I say bright, I don't mean putting bloom everywhere, I mean vibrant and intensive colors, even though it's supposed to be a whimsical fairy tale, while Avowed was so neon-saturated that you'd think you walked into a disco, despite being in the Pillars of Eternity universe, which is supposed to be colorful, but also rather dark and cold in terms of its color palettes. If Xbox's studio just can't get the vibe right for either brand, is it any wonder that people are skeptical? Granted, some might say that color palettes are just a minor detail, but art direction is huge. It's the core style that defines the entire game's atmosphere. Changing it overnight is no small feat, and if Playground Games is actively tossing out the art style from the original trilogy in favor of a generic photorealistic style, that's a major red flag. Even ignoring the art style, the glimpses of combat in this trailer just don't look promising. You see a basilisk-like monster and the protagonist does these awkward backward dodge slides that just come off as clunky. This is supposed to be a highlight selection, so it's worrisome. I rewatched other combat scenes at half speed and some of the animations work totally fine, so maybe it's just one messed up move, but it's still no great sign when that makes the final cut. Remember, Fable was never known for deep or polished combat. Its strengths were humor, moral choices, and that warm fairy tale tone. Now it's being handled by devs whose main success is making Forza, which is a fantastic racing series, but just doesn't lend them much experience in designing compelling melee or magic systems. It's possible they'll get it right eventually, but at this point I wouldn't get my hopes up. Towards the end of the trailer we see a comedic bit, a pan of roasted sausages used as lure, and the protagonist's face in profile. Let me be blunt, it still looks hideous. Yes, calm down Redditors, I'm not going to rant about The West Has Fallen, but it's definitely an odd hill for Xbox to die on, given the negative reactions and the fact that every trailer except this one was hammered by dislikes. Why keep featuring a character that repels so many on sight? Personally, I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do find it uncomfortable to play as a character that's so visually unappealing that I start to realize that they look worse than 99.9% of actual people I see daily. Maybe I'm just shallow or too young to appreciate the ugliness aesthetic, but for me it's a genuine turn-off. And it's not just about female characters. If they gave me an equally hideous male lead, I'll still balk. There's just a psychological barrier for me. And even ignoring all these points, it's important to keep in mind that Fable was always all about creating your own hero. Back in the day around Fable 3, which is a little ironic, the developers back then tried to push through a black man on the cover in order to show that you could basically make whatever hero you wanted in Fable 3. That the hero was something you could mold to your vision no matter what. And the Xbox execs back then forbade them from doing that and demanded a generic white male hero on the cover, which in the end also made it to the cover of Fable 3. That's something that the original developers are still really angry about. I remember that there was an article about that roughly a year back. Maybe it also wasn't an article but a blog post, but I remember reading something about that from just a year ago. And now, ironically, they're doing the exact same thing, just in the other direction, because in an era where people are very thin-skinned towards everything that they perceive as a forced attempt at inclusion, as a forced attempt at representing anything that isn't a white man, they tend to react aggressively towards. And now in this situation, you're pushing forth the most horrendous-looking female character model you could possibly push forth for a video game, and you're not even giving anyone any confirmation on whether your character will be customizable, on whether your hero will be able to change their appearance based on whether you do good actions or evil actions like it was common in the previous games, or even whether you can choose the gender for your character. You're given none of that information, and this leaves people with this idea that they're forced to play with that seemingly forced down your throat, terrible looking character, and obviously a lot of people will be annoyed by that. Certainly most of those people weren't real Fable fans, quote unquote, have probably never played any of the Fable games and have already forgotten this entire drama, but you're still not doing yourself a favor in trying to market a game that is very niche towards the average normal player. There are games that can afford to have stuff like that in them and still sell millions of copies just because the games are so amazing and have such a massive theoretical mass appeal that a little bit of perceived or real force DI just doesn't matter to the amount of copies they can sell, or doesn't matter in a way that's relevant enough to keep the game from succeeding. But Fable is a very niche franchise. It relies on the goodwill of virtually everyone to have the chance to be a commercial success, and if you're pissing off most of the normal audience by having a character like that, you're not doing yourself a favor in terms of increasing your chances at being commercially successful. Alright, enough ranting about the character. Let's move on to the final seconds of the trailer, where we see a chicken get kicked. It's an iconic Fable tradition, and also there's a mention of a rival hero in another trailer, presumably evoking the old days when Whisper acted as the rival/friend for your character, depending on how you treated her, even though she wouldn't accept your friendship till the arena, and you could also kill her in the arena if she was your rival, but still it feels like they're trying to evoke the memories of the good old days. If I were feeling generous, I'd say these are respectful nods to older entries, but let's be honest, you can't rely on nostalgia alone to mask a design that otherwise clashes with the series' identity. It's like sprinkling a reference of a beloved old quest in an otherwise generic, joyless game. So that's the shape of the new Fable. It's delayed to 2026, presumably because nobody at Xbox wants to repeat the fiascos of Fallout 76, Starfield, or Avowed. It's slapped with an utterly unbelievable pre-alpha label in all the footage we've seen so far, despite a near cinematic polish. It's filled with photorealistic assets that clash with the whimsical fairy tale tone. It's touting a comedic cameo or two with this chicken kicking, the sausage bait, that feel more like marketing stunts than organic references, at least in my opinion. And it's starring a protagonist that I personally find disturbingly unattractive. Now, will Playground Games nail the comedic, moral choice-driven, distinctly British vibe that made all the Fable titles so memorable? Possibly. Miracles do happen. But at this point, with the disclaimers, the contradictory marketing, and the risk of stepping on nostalgic toes, it's hard to not remain cynical. If all we get is a brand named husk with micro-comedic moments, then Fable truly might become yet another AAA disaster. And that'd be a shame for longtime fans who genuinely miss the old chicken chaser flair. Let me know what you think. Does the idea of a photorealistic Fable spark excitement? Or do you, like me, fear we're looking at a corporate lab experiment that forgot what made Fable special in the first place? Sound off with your own cynicism, optimism, or anything in between. Thanks for turning into Toasty Gaming. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay toasty. Cheers.